So is Guatemala's democracy under threat? To discuss that, let's speak to Jim Loughran from Dublin. He's worked in Guatemala with Frontline Defenders, a group that protects human rights actors at risk. Jim, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Does Morales have something to hide?
I think what the only surprising thing in the current crisis in Guatemala is that it didn't erupt sooner, because over the last 10 years, Frontline Defenders has been documenting a consistent pattern of human rights abuses, meaning human rights defenders who were smeared by officials, including the president himself, where the legal system has been co-opted by criminal and corporate interests, and where a large section of the population feel abandoned by the government. We have to remember, for example, that in Guatemala, something like 70% of the land in the country is owned by 6% of the population. So a huge number of people feel disenfranchised and that the government doesn't speak for them. And corruption, government corruption is at the heart of that issue.
Might that be true? And at the same time, might it also be true that CICIG prosecutors might have overstepped their mandate, and that's why he's going after them?
It's very clear that CICIG and the Commissioner Vasquez have been made the kind of fall guys in the government's campaign to stay in office and to maintain power. I had a meeting with Commissioner Vasquez when I was in Guatemala, and he explained that they work very closely with the Attorney General's office and with the Human Rights Ombudsman, and that they can only intervene in cases where there is a clear pattern of wrongdoing. And he has been very strong in defense of the work of CICIG, and that's why we're seeing protests on the street today, that a high proportion of the human rights defenders and the citizens of Guatemala want an end to the corruption, where a small elite maintains power, controls the government, and resists any process of reform.
And the court said you can't kick Velázquez out and you have to allow him back in. Morales said, no, I can. So what does that mean about the independence of the court system in the country?
That is the key issue, and I touched on it earlier when I said that the legal system has been co-opted by vested interests. The Constitutional Court has ruled on numerous occasions that Vasquez himself should be allowed to return to the country, that CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity and Corruption, should be allowed to continue its work. And in the end of the day, the question is whether Guatemala is a state of law or whether it is governed at the whim of a powerful elite. And it's no coincidence, for example, that in the photo call during which Jimmy Morales announced the expulsion of CICIG, that he was backed by a phalanx of high-ranking military officers. And what many people fear is that what we're seeing today is, in effect, a soft coup.
Did he only start to take on the UN-backed inquiry after his brother and son were implicated in fraud allegations?
Yeah, that has been a trigger, but this has been brewing for some time, where we've seen, for example, the former president and vice president prosecuted for corruption. We have seen, for example, that a third of the members of Congress have corruption charges pending against them. And possibly the problem for Vasquez is that he stepped on the toes of some very rich, very powerful people who've been in power for a very long time and who are simply not willing to share that power. And it's interesting, for example, that the demonstrations are being led by an organization called Godeca, which is a peasant organization. 7 of their members were murdered last year. And the reason is, there are 3 reasons. One is that they have very strong leaders, that they have the ability to mobilize nationally, and they have expressed their intention of moving into the political domain. So Jimmy Morales and his allies see Codeca and their partner organizations as both a threat and a target.
And given that CICIG had exposed Otto Perez Molina and that led to him resigning, that was in 2015. So we're talking 3.5 years ago. Has all the good work been undone in the past few months?
I think what we see is that there's a very clear choice facing both the government of Guatemala and the international community. And we should emphasize here also that the responses from Washington have been extremely weak. where they haven't responded on the detail of the move against CICIG and have simply reiterated their thanks for the government's work against corruption and impunity. But it is corruption and impunity. Corruption in Guatemala has been described as being the operating system of the state, and where the line between government administration and state functions and organized crime is so blurred as to be almost invisible. And unless that issue is addressed head on, unless the reforms that have been achieved with a huge amount of work are built on, then the future for democracy and human rights is really very depressing almost. And in fact, in all the meetings I had during the recent mission to Guatemala with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN delegations, the EU delegations, they all accepted the basic premise that the work of CICIG, the work of the Human Rights Ombudsman, and the work of the Constitutional Court was the last line of defense for democracy in Guatemala. And that's something we really have to take very seriously.
So if Washington's response is something more than the current tepidness that it is, will it make a difference?
Money talks, and in the end of the day, what some of the human rights defenders in Guatemala are calling for is that the United States, for example, should suspend all non-humanitarian aid until such times as the government agrees to abide by the rule of law and to implement the recommendations of CICIG for reform. And I think we have to remember where this crisis is coming from. Guatemala experienced a brutal civil war in which thousands of people were killed. And the UN and the government itself, the government of Guatemala and other members of the international community have acknowledged that the ongoing human rights crisis in Guatemala is rooted in the fact that they failed to deal with the issue of impunity, that human rights abuses, that killings can take place without anyone being held to account. And that is at the root of many of the problems. And it is this the failure to deliver justice, the failure to deliver economic reform, and a failure to deliver a future for the citizens of Guatemala that's driving people from Guatemala to head for the border of the United States. And if President Trump wants to deal with the issue of immigration, then maybe he needs to start looking a little bit closer to the ground in Guatemala and Honduras and neighboring countries.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. If somebody can make the argument to Trump that if you're worried about the migrant caravan, maybe you should address it at the root. But that's for a broader discussion, I guess. And we're out of time, Jim. But it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Jim Loughran, thanks for joining us.